When discussing critical thinking, it is firstly important to discuss what it means to be critical and whether it can be defined. It is also important to see if critical thinking can be explained to be a skill or in fact it is a characteristic of the individual. Within this video, I'll be discussing whether critical thinking can in fact be defined, what it is to be critical, and the relevance of being critical within the workplace. Firstly, through much research, it has been difficult to find one definition within the academic literature of defining what critical thinking is. There are many different views and opinions on the definition. For example, S. Ferret within Ken Petrus's Critical Thinking Extended Definition on page 4 discusses critical thinking to share 15 characteristics. These characteristics include having a sense of curiosity, finding solutions, listening carefully to others, and looking for evidence to support the assumptions and beliefs. However, the one problem with this definition is that if you do not have one of the characteristics, are you therefore not a critical thinker? This also contradicts what Mark Learmonth and Nancy Harding explain critical thinking to be within an article called Thinking Critically, the Case of Health Policy Research on page 4, where they explain that critical thinking is an attempt to challenge many of the dominant assumptions. There is a clear contradiction between these two explanations. The contradiction is clear as S. Ferret says you need to find evidence to support these assumptions, whereas Mark and Nancy say to disable the assumptions. The contradictions continued the more research I did within the academic literature, as Fitz 1962 has 3 stages, which is called skill acquisition within Beardwell and Claydon page 251, which describe these 3 stages to be the cognitive stage, which is understanding what is required, the rules and the concepts and how to achieve the end goals. The second stage, which is the associative stage, which is where the learner establishes understanding through practice, the stimulus response links, the correct patterns of behaviour, and gradually eliminating errors. Lastly, the autonomous stage, which is where the learner refines the motor patterns of behaviour until external sources of information become redundant and the capacity to perform secondary tasks increases. The one thing which S. Ferret and Fitz have in common, however, are that they are very positivistic approaches to critical thinking, as they are structured in phases and steps, which in reality will not always be the case due to the messiness of business. The philosophy of the social science literature generally holds that positivism is in places which emphasise on the experience in general along with the observation, and in particular testing and statistics, which is discussed on page 29 of Chris Clarke's article called Paths Between Positivism and Interpretism. Positivism therefore holds on to more statistics and numbers and research. Within Linstead, Fulop and Lilly 2009, page 17, it is argued that sources of knowledge are most useful when management are able to adapt in a meaningful and constructive manner. There has been various research studies and theories which have been demonstrated through academic literature due to using various organisations, even within labs under different sets of constraints, often within different countries and timeframes, which means that the ideas or suggestions by management have to be adapted, take account of their own interests due to the context of the situation. This consequently means that critical thinking can be argued to differ manager to manager depending on their own experience, which therefore argues against S. Ferret and Fitz descriptions of how to be critical. This can also apply to the treatment of employees by managers within organisations, as within the Hawthorne studies. This also leads on to Skank and Albelson 1997, which agrees that our common sense understanding of behaviours relies on interpretive and repetitive retire of knowledge and interpretivistic approaches. These different approaches are very apparent due to the describing of definition and actions upon what it is to be critical. An interpretivistic approach is the most fundamental challenge faced by most managers, as they have to interpret continuous flows of information to make decisions and to solve complex ill structures or ambiguous problems, which is argued by Mintzberg et al. 1976, which is in Linstead et al. 2009. It's also similar to the description within Linstead et al. By Shea and Morgan 1996, which describes critical thinking to be a connection between knowledge, imagination, and the zest for life. While researching these definitions, it became apparent to be very confusing due to the ambiguity of whether critical thinking in fact is a skill or a characteristic. However, within 1997, an article by M. Owerman, which says on page 40 that a nurse builds her critical thinking skills over time through experience. Therefore, this presents the argument of if critical thinking can be taught in the academic sense. However, within the same article, it is argued that the critical thinking care leaders must integrate strategies to foster critical thinking development in orientations, continuing education programs and ongoing interactions with staff, which highlights the potential arguments to put more critical thinking with the academic curriculum. Within J. Minger's article on page 290, Gray French 1996 argued that management in a wide sense has become more of a central importance to the world of its societies. Therefore, it must become the subject of critical evaluation. It is also argued within J. Minger's article on 219 by Wilmot in 1997 that a strong case for a particular form of critical management called critical action learning is necessary. This combines the practical stance of learning with the more sociological viewpoint of critical theory. This therefore presents contradictory academic theory on whether critical thinking is in fact a skill or characteristics upon previous experiences as a person. Del Bassett, who is a senior researcher at the think tank Reform, argues that today's curriculum is to blame and it has lost its value through its prescriptive and restrictive exams, which is arguably going to damage future organisations due to young students not being exposed to being allowed to think critically and practice critical thinking within day-to-day classes. This is true in a sense within my own experiences due to having to tick boxes in order to achieve specific grades to move on to further education, and where critical thinking was slowly introduced to me as an individual. However, it is hard to comprehend at first due to not being exposed to this particular method of learning before. Therefore, this contributes to Minger's J article on page 219, as it is argued that the importance to develop our studies' abilities to be critical. However, it is asked what it is to be critical. Is it just the cognitive skills of critical thinking, or should it involve more radical re-examination of management knowledge and practice? Ennis, however, suggested that when it comes to students, critical thinking is achieved when students are assisted in the engagement of thinking that is reflexive, and where students are actually encouraged to rethink the outcomes of their opinions as a way of further exploring the content of their own thought, and therefore contributes to a better understanding of the elements of decision making, which is highlighted within Natal and Ricky article page 272. This therefore contributes to the argument that critical thinking is in fact a skill that can be self-developed by the individual by help from external sources, whether it be a school teacher or manager. Therefore, if we take critical thinking from the viewpoint of Mark Learmonth and Nancy Harding, which explains that critical thinking is an attempt to challenge many of the dominant assumptions from a manager's perspective, this can be seen as necessary due to the ever-changing working environment along with keeping competitive. However, it has been highlighted by various academic literature that whether critical thinking is in fact a skill or something that can be taught by steps and stages. However, these contradictory opinions of what critical thinking is and how it can be achieved create more questions, as if critical thinking can be enhanced and taught, as Ennis argues, then why is there not more evidence of critical thinking within today's curriculum? This also raises concern for the younger students of today who will be future managers due to potentially not being exposed to critical thinking within day-to-day situations and therefore impacting future organisations. It has also been identified between the difference of interpretive and positivistic approaches. Therefore, are these approaches not shown enough within today's curriculum due to more positivism in my experience? As I have also stated, there have been more questions raised by the role of critical thinking within an organisation, its relevance, and also why is it not explored more in education. However, this then raises the question again of if critical thinking can be taught or if it's a characteristic. This could potentially lead on to the question of critical skills can be therefore sold within the labour market.